Today, I want to talk about something scarce, something we carry quietly, something that shapes our bodies, our minds, our families, our communities, and our churches. I want to talk about grief, but not grief as a moment, not grief as a feeling, not grief as a stage, grief as a relationship. Because grief only exists where love once lived. Grief is an echo of connection. Grief is the proof that something matters. Grief is the shadow of relationship, the evidence that our hearts were tied to someone real. And this is why the church struggles with grief, because grief requires relationship. And relationship requires presence, and presence requires compassion. And compassion is where the crisis is. When people bring grief into the church, they're not bringing a problem, they're bringing their relationships, their losses, their hopes, their disappointments, their memories, their fears. They're bringing the deepest part of their story. But many churches today don't know how to hold that story. Not because they don't care, but because somewhere along the way we traded relationship for structure. We traded presence for performance. We traded compassion for control. And the distance shows. Some people can't even reach their pastor or the leaders the pastors assign to them. Not because they're bad people, not because the system has not been set up for them, but because the system has become so big, so busy, so branded, so guarded that access is gone. You can't grieve with someone you can't reach. You can't heal with someone you can't talk to. You can't build trust with someone behind a stage or a microphone or a YouTube channel or a podcast or an inner circle. And when the church becomes a business, relationships become transactions. People become numbers, and grief becomes an inconvenience. But Jesus never treated grief like inconvenience. In chapter 11 of John, Jesus received word that Lazarus, his friend, is sick, and scripture says something interesting. Jesus loved Martha, Mary, and Lazarus. So he stayed where he was 2 more days. By the time Jesus arrives, Lazarus has been dead for 4 days. Mary is weeping, Martha is grieving, the community is mourning, and Jesus does not rush to the miracle. He entered the relationship first. Martha meets him on the road and says, "Lord, if you had been here." And Jesus doesn't rebuke her. He doesn't correct her. He doesn't shame her. He doesn't shame her grief. He speaks to her heart. I am the resurrection and the life. Not I will be, not I was, but I am right here in your grief, in your questions, in your disappointment. Then Mary comes, and Mary doesn't even speak theology. She just falls at his feet and weeps. And scripture says, when Jesus saw her weeping, he was deeply moved in spirit and troubled. And then the shortest, most powerful verse in all the Bible, Jesus wept. He wept because he loved. He wept because he was in a relationship. He wept because grief is holy ground. Jesus enters their grief before he ever calls Lazarus out of the tomb. And that is what people are longing for today. Not a church that performs, but a church that relates, a church that sees, a church that listens, a church that weeps, a church that stays. And this brings us to something we can't ignore anymore: the decline in attendance. Yes, the decline in attendance in the church. Black men are attending church less than ever, men in general. Young adults are drifting away, even women. The backbone of the church are attending less, even though they're still doing the most of the work. And we cannot blame this on the world. We cannot blame this on rebellion. We can't blame it on people not loving God. People aren't leaving God. They're leaving systems that don't look like Him. Black men say they feel judged, they feel unseen, they feel emotionally unsafe. They feel like the church doesn't speak to their reality. And let's be honest, for a Black community, fight or flight is often financial. Historically, we were excluded from financial literacy, excluded from wealth building rooms, excluded from generational wealth conversation, excluded from systems where money is negotiated and multiplied. And when Black men walk into church carrying financial stress, carrying shame, carrying pressure, carrying fear, the church often has no language for that grief. We preach tithing, but we don't teach financial healing. We preach giving, but we don't teach building. We preach stewardship, but we don't teach strategy. And that silence, that gap, that lack of compassion pushes men away. Women are tired too. Tired of carrying the emotional labor. Tired of holding their families and church together. Tired of serving without being seen. Tired of being spiritually present while emotionally empty. And grief shows up in their bodies, their physical bodies, their minds, their marriages, their relationships, their ministries. But Jesus shows us another way. In John chapter 12, Jesus enters Jerusalem, not on a war horse, not with soldiers, not with force, but on a donkey, the symbol of humility, peace, and accessibility. And the people run to him, not because he was famous, not only because he just entered someone's grief and brought them from death to life. They followed because of his compassion. They followed because of his relationship. They followed love. They followed compassion. They followed relationship. That's the Jesus people still want today. If you want men to return, if you want women to breathe again, if you want young people to feel seen, if you want the church to heal, you must rebuild relationship or build relationship. Not programs, not performances, not platforms, relationships. And that requires prayer, real prayer. Prayer that asks God to break our pride, prayer that asks God to soften systems, prayer that asks God to reshape our structures, prayer that asks God to make us compassionate people. Because if leaders are not prayerfully willing to change, the church will not change. And if the church does not change, people will continue to leave. And maybe this is the part we don't say out loud enough, that many of our leaders, especially in the Black church, already know these things. They feel the distance in the room, in their pulpits, from their pulpits, in their private time. They recognize the decline. They sense the exhaustion. They hear the silence of men and women and the signs of the young people not wanting to participate. They know the system is heavy. They know the structure is old. They know the model is tired, and some of them feel like Martha, standing in front of Jesus saying, Lord, if you have been here, caught between faith and frustration, because what they inherited and what they long to see are far from each other. So leaders aren't unwilling, they're overwhelmed. Some aren't restricted, they're grieving too. Some aren't blind, they're bound by expectation, traditions, and the fear of losing what little stability they have left. And yet Jesus stood in the middle of Mary and Martha's grief, deeply moved, fully present, not rushing, not performing. I believe he is standing with our leaders now, not to condemn them, not to expose them, but to invite them back into relationship, to remind them that resurrection doesn't begin with power. It begins with compassion. It begins with presence. It begins with willingness, because the same Jesus who called Lazarus out of the tomb is still calling church out of old structures, old fears, old ways of leading. And he is whispering to every leader who feels stuck, you don't have to have all the answers. You just have to be willing to roll away the stone. My God. To the ones who left the church, I want to say this to you gently. Give Jesus another chance. And yes, give the church another chance too. Not the church of pride, not the church of performance, not the church of distance, but the church that is willing to change when you bring your concerns to them. The church that's willing to relate. The church that's willing to grieve with you. The church that's willing to build with you. The church that needs your gifts, your voice, your presence. We cannot heal without you. We cannot grow without you. We cannot become whole without you. And to the leaders, listen here very closely. Do not give up on people. Do not give up on compassion, nor the power of it. Do not give up on relationship. Do not give up on the church. The church can rise again. The men can return. Women can breathe. The young can hope. The community can heal. But it begins with willingness. Willingness to pray. Willingness to change. Willingness to relate. Willingness to weep. Willingness to love. Because the Jesus of John chapter 11 and 12, the Jesus who weeps, the Jesus who calls forth life, the Jesus who enters humbly, is still walking with his church. He is still walking with you. So yes, there is a crisis. It is not a crisis of attendance. It is a crisis of compassion. And compassion is the one thing Jesus never ran out of. Good grief is not the end. It is the beginning of healing, the beginning of relationship, the beginning of a church that looks like Jesus. Thank you for listening. Let's keep walking towards compassion together.